The city is probably the oldest, most enduring invention of our civilization. The words are interchangeable: civilization, civil, civic, city. Cities evolve over time. They respond to crises, and historically, they emerge from crises stronger than ever before. So what are the future trends for cities, and what are the lessons of history?
Hello, I'm Vishaan Chakrabarti, founder and creative director of POW, Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, and William Worcester Dean of the College of Environmental Design at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a pleasure to be with you. Today I'm going to give a masterclass on cities, and I'm very happy to be with the Norman Foster Foundation to do this. I start with, of course, the idea that we are in a global pandemic, but I believe, as this slide shows, that we are really at the cusp of understanding what life will be like with the full force of climate change upon us. It was Mies van der Rohe who said architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space. And I believe what he meant by that is that architecture is both a mirror and a window into the challenges we face as society, including, of course, climate change. But if we're going to talk about cities in this regard, we have to start with the most fundamental building block of cities, which is the street. And this is one of my heroes past, J. Max Bond Jr., who said in New York City, for a city of immigrants, the public realm is more than ever now the street. And what's interesting is we think of the street as something that is provided for automobiles. But if you go back millennia into antiquity, you find that whether you're looking at ancient China, where the street grid was designed such that as you move north, you were thought to move upwards towards the gods, or in ancient India, where you circumambulated towards the center to reach a spiritual place. But then by the end of the 1800s, three extraordinarily important inventions transformed human history and the landscape of the planet, which includes the invention of the elevator, the invention of structural steel, and the invention of the internal combustion engine. And those three together create a post-industrial world for our pre-industrial grid. So in the top row here, you see that the pre-industrial cities work beautifully in terms of their grid, but as soon as these three inventions come about, of the elevator, steel, and the internal combustion engine, suddenly density is shoehorned into the grid, into the morphology of the pre-industrial city. And of course, we see an immediate architectural response by the beginnings of the 20th century that says, let's break free from the grid, free the automobile. Corbusier famously has living, working, recreating, and traffic as actually a form of land use, with his plan to bring down much of Paris to create what in his mind was the freer city of the automobile. In the United States, this takes hold in a very specific way after World War II with our largest infrastructure intervention by President Eisenhower, interestingly a Republican, who passes the 1956 National Highway and Defense Act, which is meant not only to disperse the population of the United States in the event of a nuclear war, but also to move around intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this, of course, has the impact of suburbanizing the United States and creating a morphology that almost reaches high art in the United States in terms of the scale of the highway intervention, the total loss of human scale as it is sort of reimagined for the automobile. And this, of course, in turn leads to worldwide suburbanization. These are 6 images from 6 continents around the world where you see the same applied over and over again, whether in the desert outside of Phoenix or the desert outside of Riyadh. This, of course, has enormous climate concerns, but also cultural concerns in their homogeneity. But the mass production of highways, of suburbia, also impacts our cities. 6 cities from around the world, and again, this mass production where a certain anonymity takes hold with the invention of the automobile and going into the late 20th century. And what we start to understand is, and this is not to be nostalgic, but to understand that a place like Venice extraordinarily experimental that basically everything in this image is illegal, from the handrail to the staircase. No architect could design this with our international building codes today. Similarly, one of the most important building blocks for density in our cities, the open light stairwell moving around the cage elevator, is also impossible under today's codes. And so we've lost some of those more innovative experimental ways of building density in favor of mass production. The mass production of windows, of steel, of automobiles, of roadways. And then, of course, as soon as you have the codes that say you need multiple elevators and multiple fire stairs, you then need a double-loaded corridor to connect all of them for efficiency. And then you find developers building not 30-unit buildings, but 200-unit buildings with a great sense of anonymity and a great sense that with this thud, this horrible, miserable thud, the same residential building is being built across the planet again and again and again and again, leading to a homogeneity and a rejection of density by worldwide populations. Just at a moment, at a political moment, where we need density for a variety of reasons, starting with the idea of urbanity itself. The Greek planner Constantine Doxiades thought of this idea of the cosmopolis, and this is actually a drawing by the Indian architect Charles Correa of Doxiades' theory of the cosmopolis, which is basically another word for urbanity. And in the Doxiades theory, the idea was that every once in a while a person who is born, perhaps in a small village, who feels different from everyone else, and they feel socially isolated, they want to change the world. And ultimately, as they move to the right of this image, they find other people like themselves in cities. And it's their sense of change, of innovation, that changes society itself. And all you have to think about is the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square to understand that this is actually precisely what happens in our world. In fact, I would argue that without cities and the change that cities foment, that nations themselves would not progress. There's also an economic idea around density, which is as people gather, we know that they innovate more, they file more patents, they create new technologies through the serendipity of collision and social friction that happens in our density. And then, of course, there's the environmental argument, which is that the closer people live together, when they live in small flats that heat and cool each other, when they use mass transit, that the carbon footprint per person reduces dramatically. And so just as the world is homogenizing through all of these codes and mass production, as I mentioned before, we have this tremendous need for people to live in more dense circumstances. And in order to explain that to people, I often start with this slide about street equity, that cars, and I don't care if the car is a rideshare service or an autonomous vehicle or an electric vehicle, that cars, as an architect, I think about cars spatially and the way cars separate human beings in a way that they are not for pedestrians or bikes or buses that use far less space per person. And so, of course, everyone's heard about the idea of the more walkable, bikeable city, and there are evangelists about this. And it's frightening when I see books called Copenhagenize something. I was born in Calcutta, and Copenhagen is a lovely place, but I don't want Calcutta to look or feel anything like Copenhagen. And so I think we need to worry about the one-size-fits-all solution, particularly because we have data now that says that when we have more walkable cities, they are actually becoming more expensive and unaffordable. And so I think we need to start fresh now in the 21st century, coming out of this pandemic, thinking about how we can build better cities. I think we need to start with the basic things that make us human. Most of us are bipeds. We need light and air. We need protection from the elements. We are subject to the forces of gravity. These are timeless factors. But then we have information age factors. We have blurring of program. We have the horizontal ground scraper. We have the idea of not autonomous individual vehicles, but autonomous mass transit, zero emission minibuses and so forth that can bring us to point. And I think these could add up to new solutions for new morphologies for our city. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about how does one take the space that's allocated for the roadbed and bring it into a new form of the 21st century courtyard and create new morphologies around this and new mid-rise but quite dense housing that is less auto-oriented with weather mitigated playgrounds and so forth, and a kind of architecture, perhaps passive house, perhaps zero carbon, and that also works off some of the ideas that came out of another strand of 20th century modernism. Many of you may recognize this image from Candelas and Woods in North Africa. And it's interesting that this is one of the projects that breaks up SIAM. SIAM, of course, the Congress for International Modern Architecture. You see this image, I believe that's Alison Smithson down at the bottom of the page. And SIAM breaks up in 1959 precisely over these issues. You have Le Corbusier enamored with the automobile, enamored with modern technology, but another group of modernists, Aldo van Eyck, Alvar Aalto, Team 10, arguing for a humanist modernism that is about a different approach. And so you have Korb drawing things like his Plan Obis, which actually, Korb is a brilliant architect, let's stipulate, but this is one of the most racist plans that has ever been drawn in human history, separating the colonizer from the colonized. Korb was actually a great advocate for the French colonial project in Northern Africa. Having that as this idea of the signature architect imposing typically his will around the world, and you still see that very much in motion today, where you see the imprint of the signature architect from going from place to place, regardless of climate, culture, or community. But you had that other strand of modernism that was represented particularly by Team 10 coming out of the breakup of SIAM in 1959 in Otterloo. What happens to that strand? Well, we are told that strand of modern architecture, the strand that fought for public housing, fought for public streets, that it failed. And Pruitt-Igoe, of course, is held up as the model of that failure. But I would encourage you to watch the documentary made by a Pruitt-Igoe resident, Pruitt-Igoe, of course, famously designed by Yamasaki, who talks about actually how wonderful and successful Pruitt-Igoe and the Tower in the Park model was in the beginning, until a lot of public policy worked to destroy it. And so by the 1970s, you have the destruction of the modern project, the destruction of the idea of the public in architecture, with both left and right in different ways saying this was a failure. And the left, of course, retreating into the Jane Jacobs kind of world of we can't have this kind of ideological idea of modernism as a public idea. And you have, of course, the right wing saying that the public sector cannot work, and with that, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. And with that all, a tremendous loss of this idea of the public, the demolition of Penn Station in 1963, its remains sitting in New Jersey. And it is out of these ideas of what it means to be the public architect that our office was born 5 years ago as the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, first in New York, now in New York and California. And we came out with a very simple and clear mission statement about what we do and what we don't do, and our mission around building lasting architecture and humanist urbanism, very much an extension of those ideas that were born in Otterloo in 1959. And I have, through the course of my life, noticed with the deindustrialization of cities that there are certain areas of intervention. That sketch on the left was a sketch I made in China in the 1990s about this idea that our cities would go through enormous upheaval moving into the 21st century, that we would move away from the hub and spoke model of cities into this lattice work of cities, into what Mayor Anne Hidalgo in Paris calls the 15-minute city. In the USA, I tend to call this the 20-minute city because of our sort of larger landmass. But this idea that within 20-minute walking distance, people could achieve most of their daily needs, all within the context of the larger city. And that architecture plays a tremendous role in that as a piece of public architecture in terms of its ground floor, in terms of its sustainability, its relationship to mass transit, its relationship to technology. And we started actually not with client-driven projects, but with social advocacy projects. One for Penn Station with the New York Times, where we imagine a recycling of Madison Square Garden, which sits above the station, into, again, this more porous kind of architecture with these before and after images. And more recently with the New York Times, with a project called NYC, or Not Your Car, in which we made the outlandish proposal to ban all private automobiles from the island of Manhattan, with the idea that, today, automobile infrastructure in Manhattan takes up 4 times the size of Central Park, almost 3,000 acres of land, and the idea that we could reuse all of that space, about 30% of Manhattan, for public transit, for pedestrians, for homeless services, for solid waste management, for people who are in wheelchairs and have accessibility issues in our cities, and to create more racial equity in our cities. Norman has also, and I have been a big advocate for bringing the park back to Park Avenue, and we talked about that in this proposal with the New York Times. Up in Harlem, the idea that communities could get involved with how to recoup this space given over to automobiles. And that this would dramatically, reducing private car demand in Manhattan, would dramatically better commutes for everyone in the area of New York City. This to me is post-pandemic critical, because a vaccine may solve the pandemic, but what the vaccine won't address is remote work being a competitor to the horrible commutes that many city dwellers face today. And by eliminating private cars in the heart of our central business districts, we can help solve that problem. That's also critical because our cities are changing. As I said, we're moving away from the central business district. And Kevin Lynch, one of my heroes when I studied urbanism at MIT, talked about the fact that the city is not the manifestation of some iron law, but rather part of changing human culture and aspiration. So this, for example, is the Domino Project, a change of human culture and aspiration, an old industrial area where we helped do the master plan for a new park that's open. This park is one of my prides and joy. It brings together people from very different communities, African American, Latinx, Orthodox Jewish, young hipster communities, very different socioeconomic backgrounds, their children all playing together in the playground in front of this heritage building, which is an old warehouse building, a sugar building, whose insides were an extraordinary array of machinery that we are now converting into a creative office building, using the tectonics of the old building, of this gap that existed between the old masonry wall and the inner workings of the building, to create that same kind of spatial organization of the interior brick and the new curtain wall, and then calling upon old industrial precedents such as Peter Barron's to create a vault structure. We're thinking also of Sterling and Kahn, of course, to replicate that gap. And we went to our Heritage Commission, our Landmarks Commission in New York, and actually quoted Semper and talked about style being the accord of an art object with its genesis, the American brick arch style being used for this industrial building, reading that context. Our idea with this is that for us, successful architecture can't be transplanted from one place and landed in another place and make sense. It has to derive from the place in which it was born. And so this is under construction today, a very, again, porous ground floor, as I mentioned before, with access to the park around it, and really an extraordinary project. And then, of course, public housing, also in Brooklyn, but in a much poorer part of Brooklyn. One of the founders of my college here at Berkeley, Catherine Bauer, said, many have forgotten or never knew that modern architecture was once primarily concerned with social and civic improvement. This work for a pastor in East Brooklyn is exactly this kind of a project, surrounded by social housing. This will be 2,000 units of all public housing, including supportive homeless housing for formerly homeless women. But again, with complete streets made for pedestrians, but tied to an architecture where the local community wanted to see a brick architecture, but still a very contemporary brick architecture. In the distance, a 300-seat performing arts center as a foreground building. And then finally, Aldo van Eyck, who said, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more, meaning that is an inhabitation of architecture that ultimately gives it its meaning. And of course, this immediately brings me to our project in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, the coldest capital in the world, where the Mongolians have this deep rural nomadic tradition. And I proposed to our client, the National Amusement Park of Mongolia, as our client, and I proposed to them that we create a village in the heart of downtown that is about an urban nomadic tradition, what the French call the flaneur, the idea that one can get lost in the city and rediscover themselves. And again, the through line among all of these projects is the questioning, in some cases, the elimination of the automobile. So this is a fully pedestrian district with a taxonomy of these different buildings, fairly low rise, but still quite dense. Everything from housing to office space to a new 250-seat folk theater to a haunted house. And this is all laid out in a 12-acre parcel in the heart of downtown Ulaanbaatar. We're working with the glass artist Jamie Carpenter and Bureau Happel to sustainably heat and cool these places, to create public spaces that people in Ulaanbaatar will use even in the harshest of winter. These colorful buildings coming from, again, the place, colors that people there would completely resonate with as their own in terms of local materials, travertine, copper, basalt, creating this quite volumetric architecture, mass associated with the cold climate. This is not a place for all glass architecture, but then the landscape in this image is critically important to understand in terms of creating place and occasion. And so my final slide, more of an artistic idea of the future of the city. Diana Agrist at Cooper Union said that in order to write with architecture, you need to read a place. And this is our idea of how one must read before they can write, in order to create, again, this idea of the humanist modern tradition that came out of Waterloo, that can continue in the 21st century as a means to solve climate change, racial injustice, social inequity coming out of this pandemic. Thank you very much.